I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob.
This
today,
is the end.
My only friend, the end.
Has there been a worse cover of that song than what we just did?
I think it's probably impossible.
I think it's probably impossible, too. And it is the end. It's the end of our 10-part series, 100 Years of Chinese Literature.
We're at the 1990s.
Which is the end of the 20th century.
In China as well as in other
everywhere
parts
else.
of the world.
It's not just in China. Tiananmen Square has happened in 89. Things are not looking good. But one of the weird things about the history of China is that Tiananmen Square happens, and then arguably the Chinese economy just gets way, way, way bigger, richer. The Chinese government gets more powerful.
I'm sorry, I don't think there's much of an argument about that, right? Like, the 1990s is really where the Chinese economy takes off. There's no ifs, ands, and buts.
Well, what I was saying, though, is it's interesting that the moment that arguably, well, it doesn't really catapult them into this, but...
No, it kind of does.
Do you think it does? The Tiananmen Square Massacre does?
I think so, because what happens is 1989 rolls around, the tanks come, and the regime is looking for legitimacy. And there is a kind of political debate for a couple of years. The conservatives sort of take power after 1989. But Deng Xiaoping pushes them aside, and he does his southern tour, which is kind of mimicking what the Qianlong Emperor did, but it's also his own kind of like swan song, right? Like, he does this tour where he goes down south, he goes to Shenzhen, he goes to several other places and goes, oh, this whole getting rich thing, that's still okay. You know, the conservatives are not going to change us economically. They are going to, take power in terms of politics, and we are going to repress any notion of democracy, which during the 1980s, that China was in some ways looking like it might become a democracy. I tell my students this, and they always find this strange, but for the 1980s, China was more democratic than Taiwan. But so 1989 happens, democracy gets shut down, but economics just kind of, after a speed bump, just kind of takes off, and it hasn't stopped, really.
Well, in part because one of the interesting stories of the 80s is the way that government economic planners, in Deng's phrasing, are crossing the river by feeling the stones. They're experimenting. What works, what doesn't? What makes money, what doesn't? Investing here, okay, that doesn't work. But by the 90s, they figured out some stuff that really does work and lean hard into it. In terms of literature and the arts, we've talked about the economy, and lots has been said about the economy in China since the 90s. It gets strange in the sense that all this energy from the 80s effectively just gets dispersed. You're on record as going, this is your favorite decade for just about everything, really, in China, literature and the arts.
The 1980s.
1980s, yeah. No, I'm sorry, not 1990s, 1980s. My favorite, most of my favorite art and poetry comes after the 1980s. Several of my favorite Chinese poets are after the 80s. Favorite filmmakers are certainly after the 80s. Favorite novelist, after the 80s. We can talk about him later. Maybe we will, when the people clamor for a 2000 to 2021 addition to our 100 years of Chinese literature. But one of the reasons that literature and the arts for me gets really interesting is because it gets dispersed, you have pockets of artists responding to their own sort of unique things. It's not let's see if we can reform China. It's what do we do with just the craft of poetry to make it interesting? But you also have the rise of big market fiction. Novels, especially in the 90s, start to become a real cash cow, and they never were before. I mean, you couldn't write a bestseller and make lots of money really until the 90s.
Yeah, so when I think of the 90s and kind of what epitomizes literature, this isn't my choice for this week, but what epitomizes literature is the sort of hooligan literature. I'm thinking particularly of Wang Shuo, who he writes for money, and he's like pretty open about that. And that kind of really strikes me as a very 1990s phenomenon, even though he was also writing in the 80s, and there were others like him.
Sure. But, because one of the things that happens is 89, the Tiananmen Square Massacre happens, and there's a couple of responses that come out of that. One of them is democracy and freedom and all the things that we were hoping to have are done.
It's sort of a midlife crisis for the baby boomers at this point. And this is kind of what I was getting at with the question of legitimacy is the Chinese government, once they killed their own citizens, they had to find some sort of legitimacy other than, that we are the protectors of the people or whatever, right? Like, because that was dead, and Maoism and Marxism were dead. So making money became the real solution. And in the 1990s, you really see the state and society turn towards, make this materialistic turn. It's kind of a Madonna materialistic girl kind of movement. We're not going to...
China is the Madonna of the 1990s.
We're not going to try and sing the song.
Oh, man, no one deserves that. That's just too painful.
But I think we should turn to our
Let's do it. Who, I ask the question, who did you choose, even though we both already know? Who did you choose?
I chose Mo Yan. So Mo Yan is writing starting in the 1980s, but I really feel like he kind of hits his stride in the 1990s.
You're pulling the same move I did with Lu Xun. Lu Xun starts writing in the teens, but really the 20s is his decade.
So his first novel is published in 1986. It's Red Sorghum. And that's really his kind of key novel. But he kind of really picks up his pace in the 1990s. And he wins the Nobel Prize in 2012, I want to say. He's the first Chinese citizen to win the Nobel Prize.
I like your raised eyebrows as you're qualifying that, because I think we've done a podcast on this, but Gao Xingjian won the Nobel Prize before him, but by then he was a French citizen, even though all of his works were still composed in Chinese. So nobody in China that I met considers him the first sort of Chinese Nobel Prize winner.
And there is this discussion of whether, up until 2012, there was this discussion of, is China's educational system too repressive, too much about rote learning to produce someone who could get a Nobel?
Which is, I think, just crazy, but whatever.
Well, the education system is very much about rote learning. That is a thing, and the kind of creativity that's required to be a Nobel laureate, I think, requires a thinking outside the box that the Chinese education system does not encourage.
Right, and that's an argument. There's others that are partly, for example, it's very, very hard to translate Chinese literature well enough to get enough people to read it. And a lot of the best Chinese literature wasn't really even in circulation enough to be appreciated. There's only been a handful of Chinese writers with enough of a circulation in the 20th century to have the exposure necessary for that.
I think those are all fair points.
Yeah. So, but Mo Yan has had that kind of circulation. Why is he your choice?
I think he just kind of represents the sort of turn in literature that the 1990s, that is the best part of the 1990s. If much of the 1990s literary works are more about making money than anything else, he at least kind of preserves something of the 1980s after 1989. He's funny. He's funny and weird. He preserves some of that same thing that I was talking about that I liked with Han Xiaogong. He's been compared at times both like Han Xiaogong to William Faulkner and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But he does it in this kind of satirical way that it kind of almost makes me think of Confederacy of Dunces or Catch-22. So I don't think the 1990s is as fun as the 1980s, but if there is a kind of high point of the 1990s in terms of writing novels, for me,
that's Mo Yan.
That's Mo Yan.
So here's a question for you. Now, what's interesting about Mo Yan is that, if you have Chinese friends, especially Chinese friends who read a lot, I get mixed responses about Mo Yan winning the Nobel Prize. Most people are very happy that a Chinese person won a Nobel Prize in literature, but most of the Chinese friends and colleagues I have are like, Mo Yan? I don't know. Like, I can think of a dozen people I wish had won a Nobel Prize. I don't know why him.
Yeah, I also think there is some truth to that, but I still think he is still my choice for the 1990s, just because what better writer can you think of operating in the 1990s?
Well, I'm going to go with my choice, but it's not going to be... This is interesting because you mentioned a writer who carries over from the 80s. My writer definitely carries over from the 80s. The writer is Xi Chuan. Xi Chuan, as I mentioned in the last podcast, was Heize's closest friend. He still owns the rights to Heize's poetry. If you want to translate Heize in a book form, you pretty much have to go through Xi Chuan. So Xi Chuan has a direct connection to one of the biggest figures from the 80s, but Xi Chuan's poetry continues to be experimental and strange and interesting up to the present. He's still writing.
Rob, you've talked with Xi Chuan.
I've never talked to Xi Chuan. I sent him an email once because
that's right.
One of my friends is his official English language translator, Lucas Klein. Lucas has said, hey, yeah, if you're going to write about Heize, you should email Xi Chuan. I said, okay. I even sent him a copy of an English translation I did of one of Heize's long poems. He never emailed me back. Not really surprised, but...
He's a pretty big deal.
He's a big deal. I mean,
we're now kind of big deals, but
he's really a big deal, yeah. Maybe if I told him I was with the Chinese Literature Podcast, he'd have gone, wow, that's awesome. Anyway, now novels go above ground and get really big and commercial. Poetry arguably goes the reverse direction and gets even more below ground.
Not arguably.
No, okay, maybe not even arguably. Definitely goes even further below ground. Partially because now that you can make a lot more money in the 90s, companies go, hey, people want to buy fiction. Let's see if we can market this.
And poetry's just, it's really hard
Yes.
to think about it as relating to making money, right?
Yeah, it's never going to be about making money because not enough people are ever going to want to buy it. But one of the interesting things that happens with a lot of the poets in the 90s is because because they're essentially kicked out, right, from considerations of making money, they're going, all right, well, if no one's going to care what we do anyway, why don't we really have some fun with this? This is why a lot of my favorite poets come out of this era and later, because there's not even really a pretense at quote-unquote changing things. This is real experimental poetry.
Can you explain more about real experimental poetry? Like what is experimental about it?
Well, let me explain. So there's I'm going to read this very, very, very quick quote from there's a book called Recite and Refuse by a friend and colleague, Nick Admison at Cornell. He's writing about Chinese prose poetry. Xi Chuan wrote a lot of prose poetry. Writes a lot of prose poetry. He's got a work from the 90s just called South Xinjiang Notes. And it has lines like this. It basically reads like a piece of prose, but it's in Chinese is also meant to be poetry. My senses are insufficient to compose lines of poetry equivalent to the colors of the mountains. My reasoning is insufficient to reconcile the tortuous history of the Gotkerg Khanate. My experience is insufficient to face the bustling humanity of Kashgar. Yangisar knives, too extravagant for slicing melons or chopping vegetables, too beautiful to murder with. One of the things that Nick talks about in his discussion of this poem, you have a lot of things happening at the same time, one of which is Xi Chuan going, all right, now let's take a particular form of writing, which here's supposed to be like a travel guide, right? South Xinjiang Notes, it's sort of be like, hey, here's what it's like traveling in South Xinjiang. Except it's written very beautifully. You're not supposed to write a travel guide beautifully. That's sort of beside the point, right? A travel guide in poetry would be very strange.
So it's a poetic travel guide?
Yes.
Or a travel guide as poetry?
Exactly. But see, this is one of the things. They start to blur the lines with what is what exactly, and why does it matter that it's not that? So that last line about the Yangisar knives being too beautiful to cut vegetables or melons is also a reflection on how this stuff is supposed to work. So when I say weird, one of the things I'm talking about is a sort of self-conscious reflection on what exactly is a poem? Why does it matter that it's a poem? Does it matter? There's a lot of questions that are left totally unresolved, and people are cool with them being totally unresolved, right? In the 80s, a lot of the poetry was experimental, but there was a need, sort of a political need to write this way, right? So when we talk about Manke and Beidao and a lot of the Misty poets, these are poets who went, we've had decades of not being able to read in our own way, so that's what we're going to do. The 90s, these people are going, yeah, but what is a poem really? I mean, just start over. Forget creating an individual space. What is it we're even doing exactly? What's the difference between a poem and a travel guide? Well, a travel guide's supposed to be useful. Okay, what if we wrote it as a poem? Well, you can't do that. Why not? I'm going to try it anyway and see what happens, right? It ends up making the travel guide idea sound really weird and arbitrary, and it makes the poem seem also weird and arbitrary. I love questions like this, and I doubt a lot of other people are going to feel the same way. But Lee's already looking at the wall like, how long is this going to have to go on for? But you asked, why is it weird? This is why it's weird, and this is why I think it's so interesting, because they're questioning what it is they're doing in the first place as they're doing it. Which really, in some ways, how else would you respond after 1989 when your art form is the only one left in the underground, right?
Yeah, the writer that I chose, Mo Yan, he is also kind of doing the same thing with the novel. Red Sorghum is this very experimental novel where you have kind of, you're not really clear on who is who, and you have like a story, an intergenerational story based in Shandong, where the author is from. And it's just like different people are narrating. It's super confusing. It's almost asking this question, what is even a novel? Do we have to, do we have to have a stable narrator? I think both of those, the poetry and the novel, kind of gestures towards this question of stability that I was going to ask you. So we both chose writers who are writing both in the 1980s and then continuing on in the 1990s. You have said that your favorite poets come after 1989, but we're both choosing writers for the 1990s that are really still just kind of digesting the lessons of the 1980s again in the 1990s. And I think you would agree with my statement that writers who kind of embody that 1990s let's make money sentiment that Wang Shuo is kind of the embodiment of, we don't like them.
Not particularly, no.
So is the 1980s the best literature of the PRC?
Well, I guess it depends entirely. See, if you say that, though, does that then mean that Mo Yan is a writer from the 80s, not the 90s, right? You've said that he comes to fruition in the 90s. I would argue Xi Chuan does the same. His stuff continues to grow and change. So to simply say that's because of the 80s, that may be where they started and got their inspiration, but then to say then it just cut off, and ever since they've just sort of been reliving the glory days, doesn't work for me. Things happen and change in Xi Chuan's poetry that are due entirely to the world he lives in now, not the 80s. I mean, again, we could start reading poetry citations, but I'm pretty sure our numbers are going to go down if I start doing that. His stuff today does not sound like poetry from the 80s. It is its own beast. He came out of the 80s, but the stuff we're reading now is definitely not poetry from the 80s. Well, we hope you have enjoyed our guided tour of the 20th century in China. Make sure you look us up on Twitter and Instagram. ChinLitPod on Twitter, Chinese Lit Pod on Instagram. We're on Patreon, aka Beer Hub.
Purchase us beer money. That's it. That's all you're doing.
That's all you're doing. Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. Not at Patreon. Just go to Patreon. That's what we are. Send us an email, Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com.
We love emails. Sometimes we're in dissertation HE double hockey stick and we don't get back to you, but we will try and get back to you.
Be finishing that up pretty soon, my friend.
Yeah, that's right.
And after that, fame and glory, right? That's the plan?
That's it, yeah.
We're going to pull a 1990s in China for our dissertation. We're going to leave the pure world of academia and go out and make tons of money.
Yeah, we have some plans for our postdoctoral life, but we'll get into those as the podcast goes on, I think.
But for now, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for surviving this very violent century in Chinese literature with us as we both walked through the massacres, and I think we also kind of massacred some sacred cows ourselves.
Yeah, we did some of the massacring ourselves. Not literally, but certainly figuratively.
Certainly no one would compare our podcast to The Great Leap Forward.
No, but neither would they compare it to, like, Mo Yan's novels either.
I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.